In the Middle Ages, love was not merely a matter of the heart, it was a dangerous intersection of passion, politics, and law, where the wrong choice of partner could lead not to heartbreak but to execution. Romance, in our modern sense, the idea of love as a purely private emotional bond, was almost non-existent for the ruling classes and heavily regulated even among commoners. Marriage was an economic alliance, a political contract, a strategic move in a game where lands, titles, and bloodlines were the stakes. To step outside those boundaries was to challenge not only the authority of family, but also the social order itself, and in an age where defiance of order was often treated as treason, love could quite literally be fatal. For the nobility, every union was a transaction measured in advantage and risk. A noblewoman who married without her family's consent could be disowned, her dowry withheld, her property seized. A nobleman who took a wife from the wrong family could find himself cut off from crucial alliances. His political support eroded overnight. But the true danger lay in the perception of loyalty. In kingdoms where loyalty was currency, the suspicion that a lord had chosen a wife for personal desire rather than strategic necessity could be spun into a narrative of betrayal. Love, in that sense, was not romantic, it was reckless, a visible crack in the armor of political discipline. Among commoners, the consequences were no less severe, though they took different forms. Village life was a tightly woven net of obligation and expectation. Marriage contracts, even for peasants, were often negotiated by families to secure labor, land access, or protection. Defying those arrangements could result in exile from the community, loss of livelihood, or public punishment. In some regions, young couples who eloped without parental approval faced ritualized shaming, paraded through the village with mocking songs, forced to stand before the church to beg forgiveness, sometimes even fined to the point of destitution. In others, especially in rural areas where honor codes ran deep, a father or brother might take violent action to restore the family's reputation, violence sanctioned, or at least ignored, by local law. The greatest peril, however, came when love crossed class boundaries. A servant and a lady, a knight and a merchant's daughter, a peasant and a nun, such relationships threatened the rigid hierarchy upon which medieval society was built. They were seen not only as breaches of propriety but as acts of social subversion, and the penalties could be brutal. A noblewoman discovered with a lover beneath her station might be confined to a convent for life or quietly poisoned to avoid scandal. A common man caught courting a noblewoman could be flogged, mutilated, or hanged, his death framed as justice for defiling the purity of the noble bloodline. In this way, love became a crime against the very structure of the world, punishable as harshly as theft or rebellion. Religious law compounded the danger. The Church, which held immense sway over medieval morality, defined marriage as a sacrament, but also imposed strict limits on who could marry whom. Unions between close relatives, even distant cousins, were often forbidden without a special dispensation, and secret marriages were considered invalid, leaving any children branded as illegitimate. Adultery was not only a sin, but, in many regions, a capital crime. Women in particular bore the brunt of this double standard. A husband's infidelity might be quietly tolerated, but a wife accused of unfaithfulness could find herself facing trial by ordeal, subjected to public humiliation, or even burned at the stake under secular law. In some areas of continental Europe, the mere rumor of adultery was enough to justify imprisonment without trial. And yet, despite the risks, love still bloomed in the cracks of this rigid world. Troubadours sang of forbidden passion. Knights swore oaths to ladies they could never marry. Lovers met in the shadows of castle gardens, in the back rooms of taverns, in the anonymity of pilgrimage routes. It was precisely because love was dangerous that it took on an intoxicating intensity. In an era where so much of life was dictated by duty and survival, the act of choosing one's own partner, of loving for the sake of love, was a rebellion. But as history shows, rebellions in the Middle Ages often ended in blood. If the written codes of medieval law and religion defined the boundaries of love, the unwritten codes of honor, blood, and vengeance enforced them with equal ferocity. And here, the human cost becomes brutally clear, because in the year 1580 in certain provinces of France and the Holy Roman Empire, the courts might punish an adulterous woman by death, but often it was her own kin who executed the sentence before any judge could speak, for an accusation alone could be enough to provoke a family justice that spared no plea for mercy. And this was not limited to peasants nobles who lived in fear of the scandal that could strip their house of influence, wealth, and dignity, and so they acted swiftly, decisively, sometimes cruelly, to erase the evidence of a forbidden love before it could bloom into open defiance. And so chronicles speak of ladies who vanished from court after whispers of an affair, of squires found hanging in the stables, of letters intercepted and burned, their authors condemned to exile or worse, their bodies left unburied as a warning. In England during the late Plantagenet era, a noblewoman's liaison with a man of lower birth could be interpreted as a challenge to the royal prerogative itself, because such unions were seen as bypassing the king's authority over the marriages of the aristocracy, and to defy the king in that way was to court a charge of treason, which was punishable by the same methods reserved for rebels hanging, drawing, and quartering for men, and burning alive for women. Rituals of death meant to obliterate the person and their memory, and yet the temptation persisted, because love was one of the few human impulses that could make people risk everything for a fleeting taste of freedom. And thus the same ballads that warned of tragedy also glamorized it, feeding a cycle in which young men and women dared to imitate the doomed romances they had heard sung in the marketplace. Among the common folk, particularly in tightly knit rural communities, the threat was not always from the crown or the church, but from neighbors, whose sense of order and propriety could be as rigid as any royal decree, for a village was a web of interdependence, and one broken thread could weaken the whole. If a girl was promised to the son of a prosperous farmer, but instead ran away with a wandering mason, it was not only a matter of pride but of survival, since land agreements, labor exchanges, and seasonal harvests often depended on such unions being fulfilled, and so the jilted family might take the matter into their own hands, rallying cousins and uncles to hunt down the couple, drag them back in chains, and either force the marriage to proceed or mete out punishment on the spot. Punishment which could range from public flogging to the silent burial of one or both lovers in the woods beyond the parish boundary. The church courts, too, played their part, and though they often claimed to be arbiters of mercy, their punishments for illicit love could ruin lives as effectively as any executioner's blade penances that stripped a person of property, status, and the right to marry again. Sentences of lifelong confinement to monastic life, orders to make humiliating public confessions wearing garments of shame marked with symbols of sin, forced to kneel at the church door during every mass, until the community's memory of the offense faded, which in small towns might mean never. For women, the danger was magnified by the double standard that defined medieval morality, because a man's infidelity could be excused as a lapse, but a woman's was framed as a moral contagion that threatened the entire household and, by extension, the stability of the realm. And so a queen suspected of loving another man could see not only her own life endangered, but also the legitimacy of her children called into question, their claims to inheritance erased, their futures destroyed. In some cases, royal consorts accused of such crimes were put on trial before the entire court, their private letters read aloud, their gestures and glances scrutinized for evidence of guilt, and though some were acquitted, others were executed on charges that modern historians suspect were fabricated to remove them from political power, their so-called love affairs serving as the perfect pretext for their enemies to act. Even for those not in the nobility, the shadow of the law was never far away. Town statutes in Italian city-states, for example, prescribed that a man caught in bed with another man's wife could be killed on the spot by the husband, without fear of prosecution, a rule that effectively turned private jealousy into legal homicide. While in parts of the Iberian Peninsula, similar laws allowed fathers to kill daughters found in compromising situations, provided the act was committed in righteous anger and in the same space where the alleged offense occurred. The result of these cultural, legal, and personal codes was a world in which love had to be concealed like a crime, where letters were written in cipher, meetings arranged through trusted go-betweens, and even a passing smile could be dangerous if seen by the wrong eyes, because one witness could be enough to set in motion a chain of accusations, trials, and deaths that would end with two names struck from the parish rolls, remembered only in whispers as the lovers who died for their hearts. And still, despite the danger, people dared. For in an age when life was short, disease rampant, and death never far away, the promise of a love chosen freely, no matter how brief, was valued by some far above. Many years of comfort in the quiet certainty of a union, arranged for reasons of family or trade, and so the Middle Ages left behind not only carefully kept records of formal agreements, but also enduring stories of those who placed affection above expectation, even when the cost was the end of their public standing. Among the most memorable accounts preserved in medieval writings are those that tell not of distant rules or abstract morals, but of the real paths taken by people whose choices reshaped their lives, and the lives of those around them. In the city of Rouen, in 1419, a young artisan named Jehan was known for his interest in the daughter of a prosperous merchant, though her family had already promised her hand to another for the benefit of a valued business alliance. The two continued to meet discreetly by the banks of the Seine, exchanging small tokens and words of commitment until their bond became known and both were separated. Jehan's name disappeared from local lists, and the young woman entered a life of quiet seclusion in England during the reign of Henry VIII. Feelings of the heart could become entangled with matters of influence at court. Anne Boleyn, whose position had once been celebrated, saw it change rapidly as court discussions shifted, and her name became linked with complex matters of state within weeks. Those closest to her were also removed from their places in the royal household, and the events became part of a larger transformation in England's political and spiritual landscape. In the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, records from Bamberg in the late 16th century tell of a miller's wife whose private thoughts for another were spoken aloud during questioning, leading to her departure from the community. In Spain, the life of Beatriz de la Cueva in 1541 shows how personal history could affect leadership. Though she was formally recognized in her role stories of an earlier attachment followed her, and when her circumstances changed unexpectedly, voices of doubt grew louder until a natural disaster struck the city, altering her path forever. In rural Italy, especially in the hill towns of Tuscany and Umbria, community disputes sometimes began with the smallest gestures, such as a greeting at a festival or a shared dance. These moments could evolve into long-standing disagreements between families, as happened in Montepulciano in 1587, when conversations between a mason and a betrothed young woman near the churchyard led to tensions that lasted well beyond the season. In all these moments, the turning points were not determined by the feelings themselves, but by the boundaries set by the world around them. And perhaps the most revealing detail is that in the medieval view, such changes in fortune were not always seen as misfortunes. They could be regarded as necessary steps to preserve harmony in the eyes of the community. The irony is that these same societies celebrated love in song, verse, and painted image, raising it to a place of honor even while shaping the limits within which it could exist, ting it as a divine gift when it unfolded within sanctioned boundaries, yet branding it as mortal sin the moment it slipped beyond those limits. The troubadours of Provence sang of courtly love, of knights who adored ladies they could never wed, and their songs spread across Europe, filling the imaginations of both peasants and princes with visions of passion more potent for being forbidden. But for those who acted upon such dreams, the price was often death, swift or lingering, public or hidden, a final silence after the fever of the heart. Thus, the Middle Ages stand as a paradox, an age that immortalized love in verse and stone, yet one in which that same love, lived too boldly, could mark a man or woman for the grave. To understand why love in the Middle Ages could be fatal, one must look beyond the private chambers and moonlit meetings to the vast stage of politics, where affection, marriage, and desire were instruments of power as potent as any sword or treaty. For in a world where dynasties were built and broken through unions, the heart was never truly free, and every match carried the weight of alliances, inheritances, and the delicate balance between rival houses. A queen's affection for a courtier could be spun into a charge of treason, not because the act itself necessarily threatened the realm, but because the perception of divided loyalty was enough to fracture the confidence of nobles and ignite rebellion. In 1314, the scandal of the Tour de Nesle erupted in the French court when the daughters-in-law of King Philip IV were accused of adultery with knights from the royal household. Whether the accusations were true or fabricated remains uncertain, but the political ramifications were devastating. 2 of the women were imprisoned for life, their lovers executed by brutal public torture, and the royal family's reputation suffered a blow that rippled through the succession crisis known as the 100 Years' War. In the Italian city-states, where ruling families like the Medici, Sforza, and Visconti wielded love and marriage as tools of diplomacy, a misplaced romance could undo years of careful political weaving. In 1476, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan, was assassinated by members of the Milanese nobility, one of whom, Carlo Visconti, was said to have acted not only from political grievance, but from jealousy over an affair involving a woman they both pursued a personal passion entwined with public ambition, ending in murder that altered the balance of power in Lombardy. In England, the Wars of the Roses were littered with such lethal entanglements. When Edward IV defied expectations and married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, in 1464, he enraged the powerful Earl of Warwick, whose plans for a French marriage alliance collapsed. Warwick's resentment eventually turned into rebellion, leading to Edward's temporary overthrow and the execution of several of Elizabeth's relatives, whose only crime was being bound to the Queen by blood and affection. In the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, where marriages were often arranged to secure the loyalty of fractious electorates, a secret liaison could be interpreted as a direct challenge to imperial authority. Thus, in the 1550s, Anna of Saxony's troubled marriage to William the Silent of Orange became a political liability when rumors of her infidelity spread, culminating in her confinement and eventual death in seclusion, her personal downfall entangled with the religious and political upheavals of the Reformation. Even in the smaller realms, where power was concentrated in a handful of noble families, love had the power to ignite feuds that could devastate entire regions. In Navarre, a betrothal broken for the sake of a romantic attachment triggered a series of retaliatory raids between noble houses in the late 15th century, leaving dozens dead and the countryside scarred for decades. What unites these stories is the understanding that in medieval Europe, love was rarely just love. It was currency, leverage, and occasionally a weapon. And when it misfired, the results could be as catastrophic as any lost battle. This is why so many romantic narratives from the period, both in literature and in real life, are shadowed by violence. The lovers of Tristan and Isolde may have been fictional, but their tragedy resonated precisely because it mirrored the reality of a world where passion could not be separated from politics. To love outside the sanctioned paths was to court suspicion, and suspicion, once seated, could grow swiftly into condemnation and death. In this landscape, even the act of falling in love was a political gamble, and those who dared to play without the protection of powerful allies often paid with their lives, leaving behind not just grief but political vacuums and vendettas that could consume entire kingdoms. Then, in the moral theater of the Middle Ages, the Church stood not merely as a guardian of souls, but as an arbiter of who could love whom, when, and under what circumstances, and its rulings could mean the difference between life and death. For love outside its sanctioned boundaries was not simply frowned upon, it was often criminalized dressed in the robes of sin and heresy, and punished with the same fervor reserved for witches and heretics. The medieval church's stance on love was inseparable from its doctrine on marriage, which it declared a sacred sacrament under divine law. This meant that unions had to be sanctioned by ecclesiastical authority, and any intimacy outside that framework, whether adulterous, clandestine, or between those forbidden to marry, was not only immoral but could be seen as a direct affront to God himself. Court records from the Inquisition reveal that cases of amorous heresy were not rare. In 1322, in Languedoc, a young woman named Beatrice de Planasoles was brought before the inquisitors not only for alleged ties to Catholic beliefs, but for her romantic liaison with a local priest. Under interrogation, her love life was dissected as evidence of spiritual corruption, and her punishment, imprisonment for life, was as much about her heart as her faith. The blending of romantic misconduct with religious deviance meant that personal desire could become a theological crime. To lust outside the approved bounds was, in the eyes of many clerics, to invite demonic influence, and confessors warned that Satan himself could enter through the gates of passion. This mindset found fertile ground in the moral panic of the late 15th century, when manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum blurred the lines between sexual sin and witchcraft, declaring that illicit love could be fueled by charms, potions, or even direct intercourse with demons, making the lovers themselves suspect as agents of the devil. In such a climate, accusations of sorcery often followed rumors of forbidden love. In 1485, in the German town of Ravensburg, a miller's daughter named Elsa was burned at the stake after being accused of ensnaring the local lord's son through magical means, yet witnesses recalled that their affair had been consensual and passionate, a simple defiance of class boundaries that became fatal when filtered through the lens of superstition and clerical authority. Even when the church stopped short of calling love demonic, its punishments could be ruinous. Public penance, in which lovers were forced to strip down to their undergarments and walk barefoot through the market square, carrying candles and confessing their sins aloud, or enforced pilgrimage, a dangerous journey to a distant shrine that could take months and expose the penitent to disease, robbery, and death on the road. Monastic chroniclers recorded with grim satisfaction the fate of those who failed to complete such pilgrimages, interpreting their deaths as divine judgment. But perhaps the most chilling aspect was the way the church's moral law could be weaponized by secular powers, kings, dukes, and bishops, who found it convenient to brand a romantic rival as sinful in order to remove them. Thus, love, in the Middle Ages, existed under a canopy of constant scrutiny, where the kiss of a forbidden partner could echo all the way to the ears of an inquisitor, and a whispered promise could carry the weight of a death sentence. In this world, passion was not only a private risk, but a public hazard, and the more it strayed from the prescribed path, the more likely it was to end not in marriage, but in the pyre. By the 14th century, secular courts had adopted many of the church's moral frameworks, meaning that a love affair could be prosecuted not just as a sin, but as a civil offense, with punishments ranging from heavy fines to mutilation or death, depending on the perceived severity and the social status of those involved. In many cities, especially in Italy and France, statutes existed that criminalized seduction, corruption of maidens, or dishonoring of women. But these terms were often broad enough to cover consensual relationships that simply offended a family's honor or a ruler's sense of order. In Florence, records show cases where young men were publicly flogged for wooing the daughters of influential merchants without formal betrothal. In some instances, the women themselves were placed under house arrest or sent to convents against their will, their personal desires erased by the demands of reputation. Among the nobility, love could be even more perilous because marriage was a tool of alliance and inheritance. Any romantic entanglement outside an arranged match could be treated as treason. Chronicles tell of Anne of Burgundy, who who in 1418 was accused of plotting with her lover to poison her husband, the Duke of Bedford. Whether the plot was real or imagined mattered little, for the mere suspicion of betrayal in love was enough to justify her removal from court and confinement in a remote castle until her death. Such stories fed the culture of fear around romance and poets of the time, while celebrating courtly love and allegory, often laced their verses with warnings that passion could destroy as easily as it could inspire. Troubadours sang of knights who died in duels over unfaithful ladies, of maidens drowned for eloping with the wrong suitor, of love letters intercepted and used as evidence in trials. The intertwining of surveillance and punishment created an atmosphere where lovers had to navigate their feelings in coded language, meeting in hidden gardens or behind chapel screens, knowing that discovery could lead to ruin. In some regions, like the German principalities, laws allowed for trial by combat in cases of alleged seduction or adultery, pitting the accused against an accuser in a sanctioned fight to the death. While rare, such duels reinforced the idea that love could legitimately be settled with lethal force. Women bore the greater burden of this danger, for their bodies were often treated as property of their fathers or husbands, and a perceived sexual transgression could strip them of dowry rights, inheritance claims, and social standing, effectively exiling them from respectable society. Men, though sometimes punished, more often faced their downfall when their affair threatened the power structures above them. An ambitious squire who courted a lord's wife might find himself conscripted into a suicidal military campaign, or quietly murdered under the guise of an accident on the hunt. The result was a world in which love, while celebrated in song and story, was shadowed by an ever-present threat. A reminder that in the Middle Ages, the heart was not free, it was a political entity, and to love without permission was to gamble with one's life. In the later decades of the Middle Ages, the idea of love was tangled in a web of obligation, honor, and danger, where even the faintest rumor of romantic involvement outside the sanctioned bonds of marriage could be a spark that ignited the fire of scandal, political collapse, or death. For the personal and the political were woven together so tightly that pulling one thread could unravel an entire court. In the courts of Europe, where noble houses maneuvered for power through alliances, arranged marriages, and dowries, love was never just about affection. It was about territory, inheritance, and the fragile balance of influence between rival factions. A queen might be married to a king she had never met before their wedding day, her worth calculated in land and gold, not in warmth or companionship, and her role was to produce heirs and uphold the prestige of her husband's lineage. Yet beneath the surface of these carefully arranged unions, human hearts still beat and desires still stirred, desires that could not always be contained by duty or law. A single exchanged glance between a queen and a foreign envoy could be interpreted as treachery. For affection was not private in such a world, it was a political act, and to fall in love with the wrong person could mean accusations of betrayal or conspiracy. The chronicles of the 1580s are filled with whispered accounts of noblewomen who paid the ultimate price for following their hearts. A young duchess in the German states, trapped in a loveless marriage to an aging count, was rumored to have given her heart to a poet in her husband's court, and though the evidence was nothing more than intercepted letters and the testimony of a jealous servant, it was enough to bring her before a tribunal, where the charge was not merely adultery, but treason, for her supposed lover was linked to a faction opposed to her husband's political ambitions. She was executed quietly, not on a public scaffold, but in the prive, courtyard of her family estate, her death recorded in the archives only as an act of moral purification. In France, in the same century, a lady-in-waiting to the queen was accused of witchcraft when her romance with a minor nobleman caused political tension between their families, and the easiest way to remove the problem was to label her as a servant of the devil, for in the fevered religious climate of the time, such charges stuck easily, and death followed swiftly. It was not only women who faced peril. Men, too, were hunted for their affections, especially if they were seen to threaten the stability of royal succession. a knight who courted the sister of a king without the monarch's consent could find himself accused of plotting to seize the throne, and the punishment for such presumption was often brutal execution. But for women, the peril was sharper, for their honor was seen as a vessel for the honor of their families, and to tarnish it was to tarnish the name of every relative they had. Families would sometimes destroy their own daughters to preserve their standing, arranging for them to be quietly poisoned or sent to a convent under false charges, where they would live out their days in isolation, their names erased from public memory. Love could also be manipulated as a weapon, with false accusations used to bring down rivals. In the courts of Italy, rivals to a duchess would sometimes fabricate evidence of an affair, planting forged letters or bribing servants to swear false testimony, knowing that once the seed of doubt was planted, it could never be entirely erased. The accused woman might be forced to undergo humiliating interrogations, sometimes even subjected to torture, until she confessed to crimes she had never committed, for in that age, a confession, even under duress, was considered proof. Love poems were dangerous possessions, as were small personal gifts like lockets or rings, for they could be used as evidence in court. In England, the shadow of Anne Boleyn's fate still lingered over the aristocracy, a constant reminder that even queens could be destroyed by allegations of infidelity, and the mere accusation, whispered in the right ear, could lead to imprisonment in the Tower and execution on Tower Green. Even in smaller principalities, where the reach of the crown was not as vast, local lords guarded their family honor with a ferocity that made any breach in decorum a potential death sentence. Love in such a world was a dangerous gamble, a roll of the dice with one's life and legacy at stake, and those who dared to play the game too boldly often discovered that the price of losing was not heartbreak but the end of everything. And yet, despite the danger, love persisted, for it was the one thing that could not be legislated out of existence, the one spark that could not be fully extinguished, and so the cycle continued, with passion drawing people together even as the noose of suspicion tightened around their necks. By the early 16th century, the danger of love in the courts and towns of Europe had evolved into something more intricate, for not only did romance risk the wrath of rulers and the stain of scandal, it also carried the weight of religious authority, which could condemn a relationship not simply as improper, but as heretical, a threat to the moral and spiritual order of society. The year 1580 sat in the shadow of decades of religious war, and in such a climate, the concept of love was twisted by the doctrines of both church and state. Marriage was sacred not as a bond between two souls, but as an institution that upheld the stability of kingdoms, and anything that threatened it could be framed as an assault on divine law. This made love a dangerous force in the eyes of those who ruled, for passion was unpredictable and uncontainable, and rulers feared nothing more than the unpredictable. In the bustling streets of Paris, a merchant's daughter might fall in love with an apprentice from a rival guild, and while such a match might seem harmless, it could disrupt carefully balanced economic alliances between powerful merchant families. The matter would be taken to the local magistrate, and before long, both lovers could find themselves accused of consorting against the interests of their betters, their private letters read aloud in court as evidence of sedition. The punishment might be public humiliation being paraded through the market square in chains, or it might be something far worse if their union was seen as having political overtones. In noble circles, the stakes were even higher. A single affair could alter the course of diplomacy between kingdoms. In one infamous case, a young baron in the court of Spain was discovered to be secretly courting the daughter of a high-ranking French ambassador, and what began as a whispered scandal quickly escalated into a diplomatic incident that risked war. The lovers were separated, the baron imprisoned in a remote fortress, and the young woman sent to a convent, her name scrubbed from the French court's records as if she had never existed. The cruelty lay not only in the punishments but in the erasure itself, for in that age, to be forgotten was a fate almost worse than death. Religious institutions were often complicit in this destruction, lending the weight of divine condemnation to political vendettas. A priest could denounce a woman from the pulpit, branding her as a seductress who lured men away from their God-given duties. And once the congregation heard such words, the woman's life could be over in all but the literal sense. In towns and villages, this power was magnified by superstition, where love that defied social order could easily be reframed as witchcraft. A woman who inspired intense affection might be accused of enchanting a man through spells or potions, and once the suspicion of sorcery took hold, the machinery of persecution moved quickly. Trials, false confessions under torture, and often execution by fire. These fears were not limited to illicit romance. Even within marriage, affection could be dangerous if it defied expected boundaries. A wife who held too much sway over her husband could be accused of manipulating him for her own gain. Her love transformed in the eyes of others into a form of treachery. In some chronicles, there are accounts of lords who were convinced by their advisors to have their wives imprisoned or even executed simply because their political enemies whispered that the women were steering the realm toward ruin through the softness of their husbands' hearts. It was in this atmosphere that the art of courtly love, once celebrated in poetry and song, became a double-edged sword. The troubadour's verses that praised unattainable ladies could be harmless entertainment, or they could be interpreted as coded declarations of real passion, and therefore as confessions of forbidden desire. Men who wrote such verses sometimes vanished, their fate unrecorded, their words erased from the collections of court poets. In the smaller courts of the German principalities, where rivalries between noble families simmered constantly, marriages were often arranged to cement fragile alliances, and the appearance of a romantic rival could be enough to topple the entire arrangement, leading to feuds that ended in bloodshed. In such a world, love was not the quiet meeting of two hearts in secret, but a perilous act that might draw the attention of enemies seen and unseen. The heart, in the Middle Ages, was never just a heart, it was a political instrument, a target for manipulation, and a potential cause of one's ruin. Those who felt its pull faced the constant question, was the brief sweetness of love worth the shadow of the axe? By the later decades of the Middle Ages, the danger of love became most visible in the way rumors moved quick as plague, uncontainable, and often deadlier than the sword. In cities like Venice, Florence, and Bruges, a whispered suggestion that a noblewoman's affection was misplaced could travel from a servant's lips to the ears of a council member before nightfall. And once suspicion took root, it became almost impossible to pull out. The sheer density of life, tightly packed streets, bustling taverns, echoing marketplaces meant that every gesture, every glance, could be observed and misinterpreted. A lady lingering too long by the window to watch a passing knight might find herself the subject of gossip by the afternoon, her supposed affair embroidered with details that never happened. The trouble was that gossip was rarely harmless. In a society where honor was currency, the mere suggestion of impropriety could bankrupt a family's reputation. For men, this might lead to duels, feuds, or loss of political standing. For women, it could mean isolation, forced confinement, or death. What made it worse was the way law and custom worked together to trap those accused. In France, for example, the Parliament of Paris could hear cases involving moral crimes, and while hard evidence was often scarce, testimony from a few respected citizens could be enough to condemn. Religious courts were even more dangerous, for they operated under the premise that sin could be proven by moral intuition. If a priest or bishop believed someone's soul was corrupted by illicit love, the burden fell on the accused to prove their innocence, often under conditions designed to break them. Torture was not always physical. It could be the slow suffocation of confinement, the deprivation of visitors, the denial of basic comforts until the accused recanted and confessed to something they never did. In rural areas, love could be weaponized in even crueler ways. A jealous neighbor might accuse a young woman of seducing her husband through charms, and before long, the entire village could turn on her. Accusations of witchcraft tied to love were not uncommon, especially in the Holy Roman Empire and Scotland, where belief in love potions and magical ensnarement was widespread. Such charges could lead directly to execution, and the accused's possessions would be seized by the local lord, giving both legal and financial incentive for these persecutions. The very language of love was suspect. Symbols, tokens, and poems carried hidden risks. A ribbon dropped in the wrong hands could be interpreted as a pledge. A carved initial on a tree could be seen as proof of a pact. In England's smaller towns, there were even bylaws that fined unmarried couples for being alone together after sunset, and the presence of a small gift flowers, a piece of fruit, could be cited as evidence of a relationship that violated those laws. The church's influence meant that love outside marriage was seen not merely as a social disruption, but as a mortal sin. Sermons regularly warned against the dangers of passion, often using vivid allegories of fire consuming the soul. Parish priests, whether sincere or politically motivated, acted as moral watchmen, reporting suspected lovers to secular authorities. And yet, in the courtly halls of kings and queens, love was both suppressed and cultivated. Suppressed when it threatened alliances, cultivated when it could be used as a political tool. Monarchs sometimes encouraged affairs between courtiers if it distracted rivals or bound them more tightly to the crown, only to later turn those same relationships into grounds for disgrace when it became convenient. This hypocrisy meant that no one could feel entirely safe. A woman favored by a king might be celebrated for her charm one day and condemned for her ambition the next. A knight admired for his gallantry might wake to find himself accused of betraying his liege through the seduction of the wrong lady. The courtly ideal, with its elaborate dances, tournaments, and poetic exchanges, gave the illusion of safety, a stage upon which love could be displayed without consequence, but it was a dangerous fiction. Beneath the music and pageantry, every move was a calculation, and one misstep could send a person from the ballroom to the dungeon. By 1580, with Europe still torn by religious strife and political fragmentation, love had become a gamble played with human lives as the stakes. For those who lost, the penalty was rarely exile or poverty alone, it was the erasure of identity, the deliberate destruction of their story so that the victors could rewrite history without them. And so, love in the Middle Ages was less a matter of the heart than a test of survival, a high-wire act where the smallest slip meant the end of everything. In the final years of the 16th century, as the Renaissance promised new freedoms in art and thought, love remained chained to the same dangers that had haunted it for centuries. Only now, the noose was tied with silken cord instead of rough rope. In the courts of Spain, France, and the Italian states, the rhetoric of love was wrapped in allegory, sonnets, and painted portraits, but beneath the gilded veneer lay a constant readiness to prosecute or even eliminate those whose affections were inconvenient. Portraiture itself became dangerous. A glance captured in oil, a subtle turn of the hand, a flower held too deliberately could be used as evidence of illicit devotion. Ambassadors carried not just political treaties between courts, but also reports of romantic entanglements that might disrupt dynastic plans, and such whispers often reached rulers before the accused even realized their reputations were at stake. In smaller towns, the dangers were cruder but no less lethal. The witch hunts that swept through Germany, France, and Scotland in the late 1500s often featured accusations tied to love gone wrong. A spurned suitor claiming he was bewitched into rejection, a widower blaming the sudden death of his second wife on a jealous neighbor's curse. Trials were public spectacles, the evidence often little more than hearsay supported by the forced confessions of the accused. The methods of coercion, sleep deprivation, public humiliation, the threat of execution broke many before the trial even began, and those who resisted were painted as obstinate sinners whose pride proved their guilt. Even in the bustling cities, where markets hummed with trade and taverns overflowed with laughter, the shadow of moral scrutiny hung over every interaction between unmarried men and women. Chaperones were expected. Public displays of affectio were discouraged, and in some places, punishable, not only by law, but by the swift violence of vigilante justice, from a community eager to protect its perceived virtue. In London, records from 1,580 show multiple cases where couples were dragged from private rooms and paraded through the streets before being fined or jailed. These punishments served as lessons to others, reinforcing the idea that love must remain within strict boundaries or face public ruin. Nobility was no protection, if anything. It intensified the peril. The higher one's station, the more dangerous a misstep. A royal marriage was not an affair of the heart but of statecraft, and any deviation from its political purpose could be seen as treason. Queens and princesses lived under constant surveillance, their every word and gesture scrutinized by ladies-in-waiting who doubled as informants. The stakes for men were equally high. A favored knight or courtier could see his fortunes rise overnight through a monarch's favor. But if rumors suggested he had captured the wrong heart, those same fortunes could collapse before he even realized he was in danger. The dance of love became a strategic performance in which survival depended on anticipating the unseen moves of political rivals, jealous neighbors, and an unforgiving clergy. In the countryside, the stakes could be fatal within hours. A man found visiting a woman alone at night could be declared her seducer and forced into marriage, or, if her family opposed the match, he might be ambushed, beaten, or killed. A woman accused of enticing a married man could find herself locked in her home, starved of social contact, until she confessed or withered away. The paradox was cruel. The same society that idealized chivalry, devotion, and courtly romance also ensured that pursuing them was a path lined with pitfalls. By the closing years of the century, the lesson was etched deep into the culture. Love was not a private matter, nor a safe one. It was a political act, a social gamble, and too often, a death sentence. This understanding lingered long after the Middle Ages were over, shaping how future generations approached romance. Those who survived learned to cloak their affections in layers of caution, to express passion only through symbols too subtle to be used as proof, and to understand that, in a world where alliances were fragile and honor was absolute, the heart could not be trusted to lead without endangering the life that carried it. By the dawn of the 14th century, the moral and political forces that shaped medieval Europe had already begun to weave love into a dangerous web of expectation, suspicion, and control. And by the time the 16th century closed, this web had only grown tighter, almost invisible yet unbreakable. Love in this era was not merely the meeting of two hearts. It was a public negotiation of honor, wealth, land, and power, overseen by both earthly authorities and the Church, whose moral code carried the weight of eternal salvation or damnation. To fall in love without permission was to trespass against the order of the world. This was especially true for those in noble or wealthy families, where marriages were alliances, and love outside them was treason in miniature. A noblewoman who exchanged letters or clandestine meetings with a man of lower status risked everything: her inheritance, her family's political alliances, and in some cases, her life. Families would not hesitate to remove the threat by sending her to a convent, marrying her off to someone far away, or, if scandal was unavoidable, spreading tales of madness or witchcraft to discredit her entirely. The danger did not end with the nobility. In small villages and towns, love that defied community norms could be fatal. A man courting a widow too soon after her husband's death could be accused of hastening the man's demise. A woman who rejected a powerful suitor might be accused of using charms or potions to manipulate his feelings, leading to charges of witchcraft. The public nature of such accusations meant that once a rumor began, it spread like fire through dry thatch, impossible to contain. Trials for moral crimes often blurred the line between love and sorcery. Inquisition records from the late 1500s detail countless cases in which women were charged not only with casting spells but with bewitching men into illicit affairs or persuading them to abandon their marriages. Love, in these cases, was portrayed not as a mutual human experience but as evidence of demonic influence, a sign that the accused had pacted with the devil to control another's heart. Men, too, were not immune to the lethal consequences of love. A knight or soldier who fell for the wrong woman, a wife of a rival noble, the betrothed of a political ally, could find himself stripped of his titles, banished, or quietly assassinated under the guise of a duel or battlefield accident. The medieval understanding of honor left no room for promise. Perceived betrayal demanded satisfaction, and satisfaction often meant blood. In urban centers like Paris, Florence, and London, where anonymity was easier but gossip was still potent, secret lovers walked a constant line between indulgence and exposure. Brothels and discreet inns became havens for forbidden liaisons. Yet these places were also watched by informants, who reported suspicious comings and goings to both religious and secular authorities. Even a visit to a perfumery or a gift of a silk ribbon could raise questions if delivered to the wrong hands. The church's role was both moral and judicial. Confessionals were places where love's secrets were whispered in hope of absolution. Yet priests, especially those loyal to local power structures, might use such information to influence political maneuvers or social outcomes. Sermons condemned lust, but the definition of lust could include almost any unapproved attraction. The medieval mind saw love as a force to be governed, not encouraged. Those who broke from that belief often discovered that the machinery of suppression was swift and merciless, designed not only to punish, but to make examples of them. Public shaming parades through the streets, wearing heavy wooden collars, or being locked in the stocks ensured that others would think twice before following a similar path. The tragedy of this system was that it did not kill love. It twisted it, forcing it underground, warping its expressions into coded gestures and veiled metaphors. Lovers learned to speak in glances, to hide messages in embroidery patterns or in the arrangement of flowers, to meet only in places where an encounter could be explained away as coincidence. Yet even with all this caution, one misstep, a misplaced word, a letter intercepted, a jealous rival's whisper could ignite a chain of events, ending in ruin or death. By the year 1580, love in Europe had become a paradox, celebrated in song and poetry as the highest of human experiences, yet treated in practice as a crime waiting to happen, to be policed, punished, and, if necessary, destroyed. By the late 16th century, the fear of uncontrolled love had merged seamlessly with the era's broader paranoia about sin, sorcery, and social disorder, creating an environment where even the smallest romantic indiscretion could be magnified into a capital offense. In rural parishes, love was not merely a private matter, it was a communal concern, because every marriage, every union was tied to the delicate balance of land ownership, alliances between families, and the reputation of the village. To love without the blessing of the community was to mark oneself as a danger to that balance. Peasant courts, often held in taverns or under the watchful eye of the village elder, might publicly interrogate couples suspected of inappropriate affection, not because the act itself was inherently criminal, but because it challenged the social fabric. A young woman who accepted a carved trinket from a man already promised to another could find herself accused of seduction or even theft, for in the eyes of the community, a gift was a bond, and a bond outside the sanctioned path was a theft of another's right. In towns, the stakes were higher. Markets and guild halls were places of both trade and gossip, where love stories, real or imagined, could spread faster than the goods for sale. A merchant's daughter seen speaking too long with an apprentice could be painted as a temptress. A craftsman caught glancing at the wrong wife could be called before the magistrate. The punishments for such breaches varied: fines, exile from the town, or public humiliation designed to erase any sense of dignity. In courts influenced by Roman law, charges of adultery were prosecuted with particular severity, especially when tied to accusations of poisoning, which were often linked without evidence to romantic rivalries. The belief was that jealousy could drive a person to murder, and thus, love itself was treated as a potential motive for lethal crimes. Ballads and moral plays reinforced this fear, telling stories of men undone by faithless lovers, women ruined by treacherous suitors, and both destroyed by the vengeance of wronged spouses. In these tales, love was never safe. It was a spark that inevitably found dry tinder. The church added a spiritual edge to this threat. Priests preached that unchaste love was the devil's most seductive trap, capable of leading even the pious into eternal damnation. This framing gave religious courts wide latitude to act on suspicion alone. A woman who dressed in bright colors or wore her hair uncovered might be accused of enticing men. Her fashion choices recast as evidence of moral corruption. Men, too, could be condemned not for acts committed, but for the sinful intent of pursuing love outside marriage. Inquisitors took confessions that were more performance than truth, extracted under the weight of threats, isolation, and, in some cases, physical torment. Even those who escaped execution often lived under a shadow that could never be lifted. Their reputations were broken, their families tainted by association. It was this constant proximity to danger that made medieval love stories both so intense and so tragic. Every meeting was a risk, every touch a gamble, and every whispered word a potential noose. Lovers learned to navigate a coded world where the wrong poem, the wrong song, or even the wrong seat at a feast could betray them. For nobles, courtly love became a double-edged sword. The elaborate rituals of chivalry, writing poems, exchanging tokens, singing beneath a lady's window were celebrated in art, yet in life they could be construed as treason against a marriage alliance. A knight who praised the beauty of a countess, not his wife, risked not just scandal but deadly retribution. For beauty was considered a form of property, and to acknowledge it without right was to challenge ownership. Thus, by 1580, the danger of love lay not only in the possibility of rejection or heartbreak, but in the intricate web of social, legal, and spiritual rules that turned affection into a potential death sentence. The Middle Ages had perfected a system in which love was poetry in public and peril in private, and the closer two hearts drew together, the nearer they came to the scaffold. By the close of the medieval period, the machinery of control over love and marriage had become so deeply embedded in both law and culture that escape from it was almost unthinkable. The crown viewed marriage alliances as tools of diplomacy, instruments to bind noble houses together and ensure loyalty to the throne. In this context, love outside arranged unions was not merely scandalous, it was political subversion. When a prince or princess dared to choose a partner for affection rather than strategy, the repercussions could alter the fate of kingdoms. Chroniclers wrote of such romances in hushed tones, knowing that too much detail could be interpreted as treason. In more modest households, love's danger was subtler but no less real. The dowry system made marriage an economic transaction, and any deviation from the planned exchange could collapse the delicate agreements that kept families afloat. A young man who wooed a girl promised to another might find himself not just beaten by her brothers, but fined by the local court for interfering in a legal contract. The language of law was often deliberately vague, allowing magistrates to fold romantic indiscretions into accusations of theft, fraud, or slander, crimes that carried severe penalties. But the most chilling threat came from the intertwining of romance and witchcraft in the public imagination. Folk belief held that love could be conjured or cursed through charms, potions, and whispered spells. Women who possessed knowledge of herbs, perfumes, or even embroidery patterns rumored to carry magical symbols could be accused of enchanting men against their will. Men who dared to accuse powerful women of such magic often found themselves applauded by the church, which framed their claims as acts of moral courage. The reverse, however, was rarely true. Women who accused men of seduction or magical coercion were often dismissed or punished themselves, their testimony seen as proof of their instability or deceit. This double standard made love an especially perilous terrain for women, who could be damned whether they pursued affection or rejected it. In urban centers, the spread of printing allowed cautionary tales to circulate widely, cementing the idea that passionate love led to destruction. Pamphlets described supposed true stories of young couples executed for adultery, their final moments witnessed by crowds who came not only to condemn, but to be entertained. Public displays of justice in the Middle Ages often became grand spectacles, where those involved in controversial romances were presented as examples meant to reinforce social order in noble courts. The risks were less visible, but no less. Serious, quiet conversations carried by servants or rivals could shift reputations in a single night. A glance at a banquet, a prolonged gesture during a dance, or a misplaced word could give rise to stories that reshaped lives. Such whispers might lead to removal from court separation from loved ones, or discreet relocation. The unspoken code for survival was discretion. Love could be felt, but not openly declared, without consequence. Still, affection found ways to endure, hidden in secluded gardens, candlelit chapels, and sheltered forest clearings, where vows were exchanged far from watchful eyes. These moments carried an intensity born from the knowledge that discovery could alter everything, and perhaps it was this very sense of risk that made such love so powerful. By the end of the 16th century, it was understood across society that in the medieval world, love was not only a private sentiment, but a force that could alter positions, names, and places. Within the community, the early 15th century offered no easing of these conditions. Instead, political, religious, and social structures became more rigid. Rulers guarded family alliances closely, and the church strengthened its influence in this environment. Noble marriages were fortresses, each spouse a key support for wealth, territory, and alliances. Any sign of unapproved relationships was treated as a breach of that structure, and vigilance extended even into private chambers, with attendants, advisors, and clerics noting any sign of unsanctioned attachment. For commoners, the matter was equally significant, though, for different reasons. In rural communities, marriage linked families through shared landwork, animals, and protection. A match that ignored these bonds could be seen as risking the stability of all involved. A refusal of an arranged union might jeopardize security or mutual aid in times of hardship. Moral courts, backed by both church and crown, were tasked with overseeing matters of conduct, and in towns, these bodies could summon individuals for questioning on matters ranging from early intimacy before marriage to alleged breaches of vows. The sessions were public, and their goal was to preserve community order. Repeated disregard for accepted norms or ties to political disputes could result in enforced separation or permanent relocation. At the more charged intersection of faith and personal bonds, some groups promoted ideas about equality in marriage or alternative forms of union. These were viewed with suspicion, and those associated with such movements could find themselves distanced from their communities, sometimes on the basis of little more than rumor. Even so, the era produced countless stories that lived on through music and verse. Minstrels sang of knights who risked everything for their chosen partners, of women who disguised themselves to remain beside those they loved during journeys or conflicts, and of partings that were remembered for generations. Such songs were sometimes discouraged by authorities who recognized their potential to inspire a belief that affection might outweigh duty. The medieval experience of love was thus defined by a delicate balance between control and longing, a flame kept carefully sheltered from scrutiny, yet always in danger of being seen higher than its keepers could manage. And in that fire lay both the beauty and the peril of the age. For those who dared to feel too deeply, knew that the line between passion and execution could be crossed with nothing more than a careless glance, a stolen kiss, or a rumor whispered in the wrong ear. By the mid-16th century, as the Renaissance began to spread its influence across Europe, the paradox of love's danger deepened rather than diminished. On one hand, art, literature, and philosophy celebrated passion, courtly devotion, and the ideal of the beloved as a source of inspiration. On the other hand, political instability, religious conflict, and the persistence of rigid social hierarchies meant that those ideals could rarely be lived without peril. For the nobility, love was still an affair of state. Royal courts became theatrical stages for intrigue, where every look, every gift, every whispered conversation might be interpreted as a political maneuver. Kings and queens themselves were not immune to scandal. Their personal relationships, when exposed, could trigger wars or diplomatic crises. The infamous case of a queen, accused of carrying on a clandestine affair with a favored courtier, became a cautionary tale across the continent. The queen's lover was executed for treason, and her own reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that even her children were treated with suspicion. For the merchant classes who were rising in wealth and influence, love was often a negotiation between personal desire and the practical demands of expanding their fortunes. Marriage contracts were drawn up with the precision of trade agreements, and deviation from them could result in ruinous lawsuits. A merchant's son caught in an affair with a rival's daughter might find not only his romance ended, but his family's business boycotted, their ships denied harbor, their credit destroyed. In the countryside, where the church's moral authority was most deeply felt, the risks were even more visceral. Parish priests, under orders to root out sin, were known to interrogate young couples suspected of intimacy before marriage. Public penance could involve standing barefoot in the churchyard during Mass, wearing a rope around one's neck as a sign of guilt. Repeat offenders, or those who openly defied the church's judgment, could be handed over to secular authorities for harsher punishment. And yet, love found ways to slip through these barriers. Secret letters passed between shutters at night, poems hidden in the margins of prayer books, tokens exchanged under the guise of market transactions. All these became the lifelines of forbidden romance. Entire networks of friends, servants, and sympathetic clergy sometimes conspired to protect lovers, though discovery meant that every conspirator risked punishment alongside the couple. Religious reform movements brought their own complications. In regions torn between Catholic and Protestant rule, a marriage across confessional lines could be as deadly as one across political factions. Such unions were seen not only as personal betrayals, but as acts of religious treason, inviting the wrath of both church and state. Families would rather see a child dead than married into the wrong faith, and in some notorious cases, they ensured it happened. The fragility of life in the period marked by disease, famine, and war only intensified the stakes. Love was both a rare comfort and a dangerous gamble, and for many, the willingness to risk everything for it was itself an act of defiance. To love in such a world was to step deliberately into the shadow of the scaffold, knowing that the kiss that sealed your bond could just as easily seal your fate. And still, for some, that was precisely what made it worth the risk. In the final years of the Middle Ages, when superstition and law still intertwined in the minds of rulers and subjects alike, the most dangerous love stories were often those that crossed invisible lines no one dared to name aloud. These were the affairs between people of vastly different stations, where the simple act of being seen together could trigger accusations of sorcery, seduction, or the deliberate ensnaring of an innocent soul. The law was not written in neutral terms. It was shaped to protect property, inheritance, and the perceived moral order. A nobleman accused of falling under the spell of a common woman could claim he had been bewitched, shifting blame to her while saving his own reputation. In such cases, the woman's fate was almost predetermined trials that were less about evidence and more about public performance, culminating in executions designed to cleanse the community of perceived corruption. For the wealthy elite, love outside of sanctioned unions was framed as a threat to dynasties. Marrying without the blessing of powerful families could invalidate inheritance claims, spark civil disputes, or, in extreme cases, result in assassinations disguised as accidents. Feast S would turn into scenes of quiet menace, where poisoned wine goblets were passed with the same grace as a toast. For the poor, love carried a different but equally lethal danger. The wrath of a lord whose property rights extended to the bodies of his serfs. A woman who refused his advances in favor of another man could see her lover conscripted into a distant war or imprisoned for fabricated crimes. The church's influence over marriage law meant that annulments, though possible for the wealthy and well-connected, were unattainable for most. Once bound, even in an abusive or loveless union, escape was nearly impossible without invoking scandal or divine condemnation. In such a world, clandestine lovers often turned to the only authority that seemed beyond earthly law fate itself. Charms, amulets, and whispered incantations promised protection, but possession of such items, if discovered, could result in charges of witchcraft. The irony was brutal. Love might drive one to seek magic for preservation, yet magic was precisely the charge that could ensure one's death. The public appetite for scandal fed this cycle. Ballads were composed about doomed couples, circulating from court to tavern, often changing details to suit the singer's audience. In these retellings, the lovers were either villains who defied divine order or martyrs whose deaths proved the cruelty of the age. By the dawn of the Renaissance, these stories had accumulated into a cultural memory that shaped how people approached romance itself. For many, the lesson was clear: love could inspire, it could elevate, but it could just as easily destroy. And the line between ecstasy and execution was one that could be crossed with a single decision. And so, in the late medieval world, to declare one's love openly was to gamble with everything: reputation, property, faith, and life. It was an act of courage or folly, depending on who told the tale afterward. And those tales were the only immortality most lovers would ever know. By the year 1500, the dangers of love in the medieval world had not diminished. They had only become more complex, woven into the web of politics, church decrees, and the unspoken codes of honor that dictated social life. In noble courts, where every gesture was calculated for advantage, romance was both a tool and a trap. A whispered word, a shared glance, even a folded letter could carry enough weight to shift alliances or ignite rivalries that would last for generations. Love was never simply a private matter, it was public currency, and, like any form of currency, it could be forged, stolen, or destroyed. The queen who showed favor to a courtier risked being painted as an adulteress. The prince who pursued a merchant's daughter might find himself accused of diluting the royal bloodline. Even in towns and villages far from royal halls, love could invite mortal danger. A betrothal, once arranged, was considered almost sacred, and to break it without the consent of the families involved could provoke blood feuds. In some regions, the concept of vendetta extended to romantic slights, meaning a rejected suitor's brothers or cousins might seek vengeance not through the law, but with steel in the night. Religious authority made matters even more perilous. The church had declared marriage a sacrament, and yet, not all unions were sanctified by love. Many were arranged purely for economic survival. Those who dared to seek affection outside such bonds were not merely breaking vows, they were challenging the divine order as interpreted by the clergy. The punishment could be public penance, barefoot processions through the streets in rough garments, or, in the gravest cases, execution under charges of adultery, fornication, or heresy. Among the peasantry, where survival depended on community trust, illicit relationships could destroy livelihoods. A shepherd who seduced a married woman might find his flock poisoned or driven off cliffs. A maid suspected of meeting a man in secret could lose her position and face starvation. Rumors traveled faster than truth, and once the label of unchaste was affixed to someone, it was nearly impossible to remove. Yet for all the danger, love persisted, perhaps because its very forbidden nature gave it a strange, intoxicating power. Lovers met under the cover of darkness, in the shadows of city walls or within the noise of market crowds, where a few stolen words could pass unnoticed. They spoke in riddles, exchanged tokens: a ribbon, a coin, a pressed flower, knowing that possession of such an object could be incriminating if discovered. Some sought protection through superstition. A sprig of rosemary hidden in a bodice was said to guard against betrayal. A carved stone worn on a leather cord might ward off the evil eye. Others entrusted their fate to sympathetic clergy or healers who knew the old ways, though trusting the wrong person could mean swift betrayal to the authorities. Every choice was a calculation of risk. In the Middle Ages, too, love without restrictions often meant facing the possibility of losing one's home position or future. And yet many chose this path, leaving behind stories that still echo as reminders of how deeply people valued personal connection. If the court was a grand stage where love could change reputations, then the wider world was a place where it could alter destinies entirely. By the late 16th century, traditions of defending personal honor through formal challenges had become common in many parts of Europe, and although officially discouraged, these customs persisted. A single rumor, a misplaced letter, or a token in the wrong hands could set in motion a series of events that reshaped relationships and alliances. Such matters were not confined to nobles. Merchants, artisans, and students also took part in defending their standing. When affection was involved for women, challenges could take other forms. A lady thought to have encouraged more than one admirer might find herself at the center of disputes, and in some cases, her family might decide to relocate her or arrange a new life situation away from public attention. In smaller communities, social tensions could arise from even casual interactions, and misunderstandings might create lasting divisions among neighbors. In such cases, formal authorities might become involved, but outcomes often depended on social rank or influence, and many issues were quietly resolved within the community, sometimes without leaving a written record. Songs and poems of the era often spoke of love's power to inspire and unite, but also hinted at its ability to disrupt order. Stories told of secret meetings, friendships tested by outside interference, or promises broken through miscommunication. These narratives, while romanticized, reflected situations that people of the time would recognize. Love, in this view, was a powerful and unpredictable force, capable of great joy but also of significant personal cost. Yet the draw of a connection not fully approved by others seemed to endure regardless of warnings. In the more controlled spaces of medieval society, personal relationships could even be used as reasons for changing someone's circumstances. Under the appearance of protecting family interests, those in positions of influence might reshape matches or alliances that they saw as unsuitable, sometimes presenting these changes as moral or political necessity. A knight who drew the attention of a royal figure could suddenly face new expectations or altered duties, all without public explanation, and women who resisted arranged partnerships might similarly find their lives redirected toward paths chosen by family or advisors. A young noblewoman who attempted to elope with a commoner risked more than social exile. She might be declared legally dead by her family and quietly disposed of in a remote estate, or forced into a convent where the harsh conditions would finish what public scandal had begun. In smaller communities, the methods were cruder but equally final. A suspected adulteress might be drowned in a river under the guise of trial by water, her survival interpreted as proof of innocence, but her death seen as divine judgment. Neighbors would watch, some with pity, others with grim satisfaction, as the body was carried away by the current. Even those who tried to hide their love were not always safe. Letters could be intercepted, and clandestine meetings could be betrayed by servants seeking favor with a master. Once suspicion took root, it was difficult to erase. Gossip traveled faster than truth, and by the time an accusation reached the ears of authority, it was often accompanied by enough embellishment to seal a fate. And yet, despite these mortal risks, love continued to flourish. In secret corridors, in forest clearings, in the stolen moments between prayers. Perhaps it was precisely the danger that gave it such an irresistible pull, the knowledge that each meeting might be the last, that each touch might carry the weight of finality. In the medieval mind, love and death were not opposing forces but twin threads in the same tapestry, each giving the other meaning. To love was to risk dying, and to die for love was, in some circles, considered the noblest end imaginable. The poets immortalized such endings. The troubadours sang them across courts and taverns, and in doing so, they ensured that the next generation would hear the warnings and ignore them just as recklessly. Love in the Middle Ages was never merely an emotion. It was a gamble played with life itself, and far too many discovered, too late, that the wager could not be undone. By the dawn of the late Middle Ages, the lethal entanglement of love and law had become so entrenched that entire legal codes, included clauses specifically targeting illicit or unauthorized romance. Royal courts, keenly aware of the political volatility that could arise from personal attachments, issued decrees forbidding certain marriages without the consent of the sovereign. These laws were not idle words, they carried the full weight of enforcement, and their violation was considered a direct affront to the throne. The result was a society in which marriage, far from being a purely personal union, was a tool of statecraft, and love, unless it aligned perfectly with political needs, was an inherently subversive act. In towns and villages, the reach of these rules was amplified by the church's moral authority. Ecclesiastical courts, presided over by bishops or their appointees, could summon accused lovers and question them in public hearings designed to shame as much as to judge. Adultery, fornication, and even excessive displays of affection between unmarried individuals could bring formal charges, with punishments ranging from public penance to corporal discipline. In rural parishes, a whispered accusation was often enough to prompt a priest to announce an inquiry from the pulpit, ensuring that the matter was discussed over every market stall and hearth fire before the accused ever had a chance to defend themselves. And yet, it was not only the law that made love perilous, it was the culture of surveillance that pervaded medieval life. Servants, apprentices, and even family members could be compelled to act as informants, whether through loyalty to a master, the promise of reward, or the fear of punishment themselves. Privacy was nearly impossible. Letters could be opened, meetings interrupted, and even coded language in poetry or song could be interpreted as evidence of forbidden affection. Lovers, aware of these dangers, developed elaborate systems of signals, a ribbon tied in a particular way, a specific verse recited in a public setting, a flower left at an agreed location. These codes, romantic in their ingenuity, could also be deadly if deciphered by the wrong eyes. In the courts of nobility, the stakes were even higher. A queen who appeared too close to a favored knight could find herself accused of compromising the royal bloodline, an offense considered tantamount to treason. The knight might be executed, and the queen could be imprisoned, or, in extreme cases, forced into a cloister for life. Chroniclers recorded such scandals not only for their sensational value but as moral exempla, warning others of the dangers of ungoverned passion. But even with these warnings, love refused to be stamped out. It thrived in defiance in the stolen moments at a jousting tournament, in the quiet exchange of glances during Mass, in the shadowed corners of a banquet hall where words were few but intentions unmistakable. In this world, every heartbeat carried both the thrill of connection and the dread of discovery. For in the Middle Ages, to love boldly was to gamble with the most final of stakes. If the laws of church and crown were the visible walls of the prison in which love was confined, then the invisible bars were built from rumor, jealousy, and the dangerous allure of scandal. In medieval Europe, one whispered word could travel faster than any messenger, carried from the lips of a kitchen maid to the ears of a steward, then passed to a clerk, and within hours, reaching the chambers of a lord or bishop. This web of human communication, oiled by gossip and sharpened by envy, was both entertainment and weapon. For those in power, it was an effective means of control. For lovers, it was a constant threat. In the 1580s, records from ecclesiastical courts show countless cases where a mere accusation without witness, without physical proof, was enough to ruin lives. A young woman might be called to answer before the bishop simply because she had been seen speaking to a man not of her family at the village well. A merchant's son could be summoned for smiling too warmly at the daughter of a rival guildmaster. The law demanded confessions, and in the absence of voluntary admissions, confessions could be forced. The church, convinced that sin hid behind silence, permitted interrogations that blurred the line between spiritual discipline and physical coercion. For those of noble birth, the danger was magnified by politics. A marriage between two powerful houses could shift alliances, tip balances of trade, or threaten a king's hold over a region. Therefore, clandestine romances among the nobility were treated not just as personal indiscretions, but as potential acts of rebellion. Chroniclers tell of dukes who ordered the quiet poisoning of knights rumored to have grown too close to their wives or daughters, and of royal counselors who intercepted and burned letters before their recipients could even guess at their existence. The survival of a love affair depended on discretion so absolute that it often resembled espionage. Lovers met in places where no one thought to look, in abandoned chapels, in the hollows of ruined towers, in the meadows beyond the village during the hours when honest folk were expected to be at work. Even so, the risk was ever present. A shepherd grazing his flock might stumble upon them, or a wandering friar might pass too near and hear their voices. And once seen, once heard, the chain of suspicion began, often unstoppable, often fatal. The penalties for transgression were shaped by both local custom and the social standing of the accused. Commoners might face public whipping, exile, or forced marriages to respectable partners chosen by their families. Nobles, however, faced the far more theatrical punishments designed to make examples of them: public trials, ritualized humiliations, and in some cases, executions carried out with ceremonial pomp to remind all present that love, when it defied the ordained order, was not romantic, it was treasonous. Yet, for all this, the age produced some of the most enduring tales of love precisely because the risk was so high. Minstrels sang of doomed knights and noble ladies. Poets wove metaphors that danced around the boundaries of acceptability. And in candlelit chambers, readers traced the lines of forbidden verse with both longing and fear. For in the Middle Ages, love's beauty was sharpened by its peril, and every tender word was spoken as if it might be the last. And so, the final chapter of love in the Middle Ages is not written in ink, but in the quiet spaces between recorded events, in the silences where history chose to look away. The chroniclers were often men of the court or the church, bound by their own loyalties and fears, and thus much of what truly happened passed into memory without ever becoming part of the official record. But the fragments that remain tell us enough to know the truth, that in the world of the 14th to 16th centuries, love was rarely just between two people. It was a triangle, at minimum, lovers and the ever-present shadow of judgment. The most fortunate couples found ways to channel their affection into forms the law could not condemn. Some married under the protection of powerful patrons who shielded them from reprisal, arranging unions in secret chapels and presenting them to the world only when the political consequences had been managed. Others transformed their passion into a religious devotion, disguising love poems as hymns and painting their beloved's face into the features of saints on church frescoes. But these were exceptions. For most, the reality was harsher. In 1583, a trial in Rouen recorded the execution of a young woman accused of enticement to adultery, simply for carrying a pressed flower given to her by a man engaged to another. In Prague, a scribe's apprentice was drowned in the Vltava for penning letters deemed incendiary to the moral order, though the letters themselves contained nothing more than lines of verse praising the moonlight on a certain window. Such cases were not anomalies, they were warnings, meant to seep into the consciousness of the people and remain there. Every mother telling her daughter to keep her eyes lowered, every father steering his son away from the company of married women, was acting out of the memory of such punishments. Love in that time was not only dangerous when it was illicit, it was dangerous simply when it was visible. Displays of affection, even within marriage, could invite suspicion if they crossed the thin, shifting line between propriety and impropriety. A king might suspect his vassal of seeking too much influence if he saw him deeply adored by his wife. A rival could twist the sight of a kiss into proof of conspiracy. To survive, love had to become coded, layered, hidden in glances that lasted no longer than the beat of a heart. And yet, perhaps that was why it burned so brightly. The knowledge that every meeting could be the last lent intensity to every moment, turned every parting into a private tragedy. The modern world remembers medieval love through the romanticized lens of troubadour songs and courtly epics. But to live it was to walk a narrow path with the abyss on either side. Those who succeeded in keeping their hearts safe were as much strategists as they were lovers, moving through their lives like chess players, always thinking 3 moves ahead, always watching for the hand that might tip over the board. And those who failed became stories sometimes as martyrs of romance, more often as cautionary tales told to remind others that in that time and place, love could indeed lead to death.